Solidarity and the Neo-Narodniks by Maurice Brinton. Big Flame is a Merseyside group which publishes occasional broadsheets relating to working class struggles. Some of their publications have been excellent. We have even used some of their material, but others are pretty confused. They have not made any clear statements about their political beliefs, largely because as a group, they do not appear to have any. In private conversations, some call themselves anarchists, some Maoists, and some, quote, third worldist, end quote. Still others boast about being non-political. What unites them is a certain concept of industrial work, which they believe can transcend politics. A few weeks ago, Solidarity and other Solidarity groups received a couple of undated, photostated sheets from the publishers of Big Flame. In these, they severely criticize our most recent pamphlet, Under New Management, the Fisher-Bendix Occupation. They even describe some of the views put forward in this pamphlet as, quote, criminal, end quote. The subject matter they object to had not previously been discussed between us. We feel that the matters raised and the methods in which they were raised deserve wider discussion. They are examples of much that is wrong with the movement. We have therefore decided to publish the Big Flame letter in full, together with a reply. In the course of this reply, we hope to initiate a wider political discussion of the differences between, quote, militants and, quote, revolutionaries, and of the differences between the concept of, quote, autonomy and the concept of, quote, spontaneity. We hope that this discussion will transcend our particular differences with Big Flame. To give readers a better insight into the way Big Flame viewed the recent struggle at Fisher-Bendix, we are also publishing excerpts from their broadsheet about the dispute. Having read these documents carefully, we suggest that readers look again at our pamphlet and draw their own conclusions. The Big Flame Letter. This is a letter of criticism addressed to Solidarity London about the recent pamphlet, Under New Management, the Fisher-Bendix Occupation. We think that the pamphlet is itself a product of the way in which Solidarity works, and that it shows a large gap between your theory and practice. Despite your theory of self-activity and self-manage, you are mainly a pamphlet-producing group. Therefore, your response to any important issue is to write a pamphlet or an article about it. But because as a group you are divorced from working-class struggles, you are unable to write about the situation with any real understanding. A clear example of this is the way Solidarity acted about Fisher-Bendix. 3 of your members came up to Kirkby to visit the factory. But what can you understand from a visit? The draft of the pamphlet was written on the basis of a discussion with members of the occupation committee. Coming in from the outside, not knowing anyone in the factory, you could only speak to the committee, but remember, you get their view, which is not necessarily of all the workers. Throughout the pamphlet, there is a constant confusion between workers and shop stewards. You say, quote, the stewards remaining in the factory had been... Excuse me. A little bit of a breeze here. Shirt's blowing apart. Gotta button it up. Okay. You say, quote, the stewards remaining in the factory had given the signal for workers to join in a march in the admin block as previously arranged with the stewards who were, quote, negotiating, end quote. In fact, this march on the admin building was not organized or led by the stewards, but by a group of young workers. Effectively, you have denied the autonomy and self-activity of these workers, something which Solidarity has spent much time denouncing other groups for doing. But as we said, this kind of thing is inevitable from the whole way in which you write about struggles, whilst being divorced from them. At least when groups like IS, International Socialism, do this, they know they're doing it. Though this is the logic of their position, which says that they must recruit shop stewards as being the vanguard of the working class. Obviously, they cannot criticize them too much if they want to recruit them, and they were trying very hard to recruit Jack Spriggs, the convener. Although you say, quote, the stewards then started to plan a course of action, end quote, and that, quote, the stewards were now negotiating with their own objectives in mind, end quote, and again, quote, it was agreed that the workers would respond to a call from the stewards, end quote. Yet you are also able to say, quote, the workers set about organizing committees to take charge of various aspects of the occupation, end quote. This is not so. The stewards did it. Towards the end of the pamphlet, we have some euphoria about how the occupation was run. We quote, the workers, quote, the workers are developing their own self-confidence to act for themselves. They are showing in practice how to solve problems on the basis of real democratic decision-making. I learned something very new at Fisher Bendix. We asked about how decisions were made. How did the committees function? End quote. Quote, the occupation committee was based on the original shop stewards committee covering the workers as members of different unions, but it was now an autonomous committee with many additions designed to run the occupation in daily contact with all the workers. This is the great advantage of an occupation. There are always rank and file workers on hand to see what is going on. They can constantly be consulted, or for that matter, intervene if they feel it necessary, end quote. The reality was very different. All the decisions and all the interesting activity was done by the committee. Relationships did not basically change during the occupation. There was still a passive majority and an active minority who ran the show. The mass meetings did not, quote, send a thrill right through, end quote, anyone. They were passive events. The only speakers were those from the platform, sometimes only the convener who would speak. The speeches were followed by applause and a ritual show of hands for the TV cameras. There were no important questions asked or any general discussion. Everything was left to the committee and merely ratified by the mass meetings. Even at the last mass meeting, there was no discussion about the details or the implications of the agreement, which had been mediated by Harold Wilson. When you say that the committee, quote, was now an autonomous committee, end quote, that was truer than you think. It was autonomous unto itself and not really accountable to the workers because with so little real involvement or information themselves, they were in no position to question the committee. There were several workers who were very critical of the way the committee was set up and the way it operated, but there were not enough of them, so they did not feel confident or strong enough to voice their criticisms. While saying all this, we don't really blame the people on the committee. They acted in the way that good trade unionists always do within the structures that they have always known. Because of this, it is all the more criminal for revolutionary groups like Solidarity to bolster up these attitudes and these structures, which help to maintain the passivity of masses of working class people. End of the letter. The quote, big flame, end quote, broadsheet excerpt. Bendix, how the workers took over. A group of workers say how it happened. After the Christmas holiday, the factory grew tense. Thorns said the run down would begin on January 3rd, a Monday. Everybody felt things were coming to a head. Sit-ins were being discussed. There was a false start on the 4th. Tuesday, when the stewards issued a half-hour ultimatum to the bosses, but it was soon extended for 24 hours. It was obvious Thorns didn't really take our threats seriously. They weren't taking any precautions against a sit-in. Over the last few weeks, some of us had got together because we felt something had to be done about the close down. There were about 18 of us. Our idea was to stage a demonstration that would prove to management that we were dead serious. The stewards were not alone in the struggle. On Wednesday, the ultimatum ran out and the stewards were meeting the management in the boardroom. We were only certain about 5 minutes before it happened that we wanted a demo, and we had to keep quiet because of security. So when we started the march to the administration, it wasn't really spontaneous for us. About 150 workers filed up the stairs shouting, quote, industrial assassin, end quote. But as we got nearer to the boardroom, it turned into a softer chant of, quote, out, 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 end quote. This was it. We'd forced the issue and shown how militant we were, but outside the boardroom door, we suddenly felt childish. Nobody wanted to go in. It was like a barrier at the door that we hadn't the nerve to cross, after we'd spent months and years taking orders from the managers. Outside, there was this terrible feeling of frustration because nobody would walk in. Suddenly, Tom, probably knowing there was no choice, stepped in and the rest followed. Once you're in, there's no problem. They're only men. Within a few minutes, the boardroom was packed tight with over 50 of us. The atmosphere was so tense that one wrong word would have turned it into a Barney. Then Jack Spriggs, the convener, got up and told the management they had 15 minutes to make up their minds or we would have to ask them to leave the premises. If they were scared, and they must have been, seeing the looks on our faces, they didn't show it. Of course, they left. You see, there comes a point when demos have to stop and action begins. We'd no idea until it happened that there would be an occupation that morning. It just happened spontaneously. It came out of the situation, and suddenly everybody knew what we had to do without anyone saying, quote, "Right, lad, we're going to have a sit-in," end quote. During the 9-week strike, only about 50 of us were involved. It was difficult to find pickets, and some workers were out there 14 hours a day. I also think we're doing Thorns more damage this way. We're doing Thorns more damage this way. Of course, a sit-in would be useless if thorns were skint, but we don't believe they are. They've got orders for a £1 million worth of radiators for the next few years. I think this has shown the utter folly of strikes. Women we couldn't get out with us on the 9-week strike are now involved as anyone else in the occupation. And there's another thing about sit-ins. He pointed to a worker across the table, works 9 feet away from me, but this is the first time I've ever talked to him. This has brought us all closer together and everybody's talking about things. In a way, we're not so inhibited now. These sit-ins should be the start of our industrial revolution. The workers should be left to run the factories providing they do it efficiently. We can't leave it to anybody else anymore. There's no choice between the governments. The problem here is that we're not all involved in what's going on. 20 stewards are doing nearly everything. I'm just a glorified telephone arranging pickets so that a few people can go to meetings to make decisions I'll follow. There weren't enough stewards. One department has 2 stewards for 240 men. It's a big problem. We're going to have to sort out together if we're going to stick together. Our reply. 1. Criticisms. Leaving aside for the moment the abuse, quote, criminal, end quote, bolstering up of reactionary attitudes and structures, the snidey allegations, quote, mainly a pamphlet-producing group divorced from working-class struggles, end quote, and the factual inaccuracies, quote, coming from the outside, you could hardly speak to the committee, end quote, all of which we deal with later. The Big Flame letter contains 2 main criticisms of the Solidarity pamphlet. A. The first criticism is that the Solidarity pamphlet understressed the action of the rank and file and overstressed the role of shop stewards. Solidarity, it is alleged, constantly failed to differentiate between workers and stewards. Underlying this criticism is, of course, the assumption that the stewards at Fisher Bendix were totally integrated into the trade union bureaucracy. According to Big Flame, the march on the admin block and the occupation of the boardroom were, quote, not organized or led by the stewards, end quote. The march and occupation were described as, quote, spontaneous, end quote, events led by a group of young workers. Quote, we'd no idea until it happened that there would be an occupation that morning. It just happened spontaneously. It came out of the situation, end quote. According to Big Flame, the Solidarity pamphlet, quote, effectively denied the autonomy and self-activity of these workers, something which Solidarity has spent much time denouncing other groups for doing, end quote. B. The second criticism is that the Solidarity pamphlet did the very opposite. It was, quote, euphoric, end quote. It overstressed rank-and-file participation during the occupation and understressed the bureaucratic maneuvers of the union machine. To our version of what happened at Fisher Bendix, Big Flame counterposes another reality. Quote, all the decisions and all the interesting activity was done by the committee. Relationships did not basically change during the occupation. There was still a passive majority and an active minority who ran the show, end quote. Solidarity is no longer accused of denying anyone's autonomy. We are now accused of alleging autonomy where in fact there is none. According to Big Flame, both defects in our pamphlet stem from a common source, the fact that we, quote, are divorced from working class struggle, end quote. Here's my coffee. Yes. Let me get a swiggeroony. So good. 2. The facts. Let us deal with these criticisms one by one, bringing them down from the realm of fantasy and submitting them to a confrontation with a few hard facts. Firstly, to dispose of some red herrings, we reject the allegation that Solidarity is, quote, mainly a pamphlet-producing group, end quote, divorced from working-class struggle. We certainly produce pamphlets, which is presumably better than not producing pamphlets, and probably marginally better, i.e. of more lasting value than producing broadsheets. But we also try to produce and propagate ideas, not just about working-class struggle, but about all areas where the system is being challenged, about politics, in fact. We also feel that these ideas should be coherent. In our opinion, an informed and conscious working class, understanding what it wants, knowing how it will have to struggle to achieve it, and aware of the obstacles, internal and external, it will have to overthrow, is an essential precondition for any significant social change. We hold this belief more deeply, as it is for us the basis both of meaningful struggle today and non-manipulated, self-managed society tomorrow. And because of this, we are as much concerned with the direction in which we are moving as with the movement itself. Quote, all movement and no direction, end quote, is certainly not our motto. We are concerned with the lasting effects of what we do or say, rather than with demographic declarations or mindless buzzing around from one dispute to another. Secondly, did we get an accurate idea of what was going on at Fisher Bendix? 7 comrades visited the place, 2 of them twice. They were experienced comrades with long records of struggle as militant stewards and conveners. We don't like to engage in such, quote, prolier than thou, end quote, declamations, and are only prompted to do so to refute the inaccurate allegations of the Big Flame letter. Who did our comrades speak to in their search for information? It is quite untrue that they, quote, only spoke to the committee, end quote. They spoke to many rank-and-file workers, in addition to stewards and to those active on some of the committees. They spoke to workers just sitting around and to others playing cards or bingo. It is true, and here Big Flame may have a point, that had we spoken to more workers, on more occasions other facts may have emerged, but we preferred urgently to disseminate those facts we did get hold of in the hope that they would further the development of the struggle itself, than to stay at home and get none of the facts, for which we would doubtless have been criticized by Big Flame. Let us now turn to the 2 specific areas of Big Flame's criticism of the Solidarity pamphlet. We can imagine no better way of vindicating our view of what happened than by taking up some of the statements made by Big Flame itself. When one is as politically confused as Big Flame, one doesn't worry unduly about holding and disseminating mutually contradictory ideas. Unfortunately, they can't all be simultaneously true, and some of the chickens will inevitably come home to roost. First, was the occupation, quote, spontaneous, end quote? Was it decided on the spur of the moment by people who, quote, had no idea until it happened that there would be an occupation that morning, end quote? This is what Big Flame alleges. Let the Big Flame broadsheet refute the Big Flame letter. In their article, Bendix, How the Workers Took Over, a group of workers say how it happened, end quote, we are told that after the Christmas holiday, quote, sit-ins were being discussed, end quote. So the idea of a sit-in was around. The day before the sit-in started, a group of workers were discussing a demonstration to show that, quote, the stewards were not alone in the struggle, end quote. If this revealing sentence means anything at all, it means that the stewards were contemplating action and that the groups of workers were also feeling the need for action and were planning for action. Let us now turn to the central event, the famous march onto the admin block. Was it really decided only 5 minutes before it happened? If the march was a, quote, if the march was as, quote, spontaneous, end quote, as Big Flame alleges, can they explain why, during the march, the master keys to all parts of the plant were taken from the place where they were usually kept, as was reported in our pamphlet? Was this some kind of, quote, spontaneous, end quote, divine foresight? Did those who, quote, spontaneously, end quote, started the demo think of the keys before they even knew there was going to be an occupation of the boardroom? Or does Big Flame deny the whole episode of the keys? We now reach the door of the boardroom. According to Big Flame, Big Flame broadsheet, there was, quote, a terrible feeling of frustration because nobody would walk in. Suddenly Tom, probably knowing there was no choice, stepped in and the rest followed, end quote. But who was this mysterious Tom, whose hand was being thus guided by an inexorable destiny? Why has Tom got no surname? Could he possibly be one of those reactionary stewards whom Solidarity is constantly mixing up with the workers? To be more specific, could he be one Tom Staples, treasurer of the Occupation Committee, secretary of the Kirkby, Hoyton, and Prescott Trades Council, and a member of the political party for which neither Big Flame nor Solidarity have much time? Let us continue our, quote, spontaneous, end quote, excursion with Big Flame Jack Spriggs. The works conveyor gets up in the boardroom. Jack Spriggs, the works convener, gets up in the boardroom. Jack Spriggs tells the management, quote, they had 15 minutes to make up their minds, end quote. Was Jack really saying the first thing that passed through his head? Was he really acting on the spur of the moment? Was his statement really an impromptu utterance not previously discussed with other stewards? Are we really to believe that Jack Spriggs had been inadvertently sucked into a demonstration led by 18 young workers, not quite knowing what was happening to him and what it might all lead to? Big Flame should really not project its own naivety onto others. Footnote. As far back as December 11th, 1971, Socialist Worker carried an interview with Jack Spriggs in which he explained how, quote, inside the Fisher-Bendix factory, a 50p levy is being built up as a fighting fund. Ultimately, our main weapon will be the sit-in strike. A sit-in here will provide a focal point for a fight back against unemployment throughout Merseyside. End quote. End footnote. In our pamphlet, we mentioned the systematic preparation for the sit-in. We describe how workers from Fisher-Bendix had, over a period of weeks, visited UCS and Plessy's, and more recently, Alice Chalmers. We report how they had studied various types of occupation to see what would best suit their own particular circumstances and needs. Is this true or isn't it? Would Big Flame like to face our informants and tell them they were inventing all this? Had there not been extensive discussions about appropriate modes of action? Are we ready to believe that nobody knew the occupation was going to take place on that particular day? Anyone saying this at Bendix would be laughed out of court. There are other strange omissions in the Big Flame account of events. There is no mention of the fact that there had been a joint meeting of staff and manual workers, the first for many a month, on the day before the occupation, or of the fact that the workers and some of the staff in the admin block immediately joined the shop floor workers as part of a concerted plan of action. Why are these crucial facts omitted? Could it be because they clash with Big Flame's account of how the occupation developed? To ignore some facts and to distort others in order to show that the Fisher-Bendix occupation was the outcome of a purely, quote, spontaneous, end quote, action by a group of young workers, and to assert that the stewards had nothing at all to do with it is rather pointless. It is not going to kid any of those who took part. Are the, quote, facts, end quote, being presented in this way in order to encourage others to act in a similar way? Is the purpose to create a myth? Such cynical manipulation of the facts reveals a basically contemptuous attitude, unfortunately quite widespread among certain sections of the, quote, revolutionary, end quote, movement today. What is implied is that workers are too stupid to accept reality as it is, and therefore have to be jogged along with injections at the appropriate time of doses of revolutionary mythology. Let us now turn to Big Flame's second point. Was the occupation as bureaucratically run as Big Flame implies? Did the relationship change just a little during the sit-in? Didn't anything new emerge? Is the balance sheet totally negative? Was it a dispute, quote, just like any other, end quote? To ask these questions is to answer them. We presume, although we would like reassurance on this point, that Big Flame would not have been interested in the dispute if it had been just, quote, like any other, end quote. Again, their own account in their broadsheet refutes what they say in their letter. We are told in the broadsheet that, quote, these workers no longer leave anything to their shop stewards and the negotiators, end quote, and that they now, quote, have a new attitude to politics, end quote. Either this is true, in which case the criticism they make of Solidarity's description of the occupation collapses, or it is untrue, in which case they are again engaging in their little game of revolutionary myth-making. The broadsheet claims that, quote, women we couldn't get out with us on the 9-week strike are now as involved as anyone else in the occupation. This has brought us closer together, and everybody is talking about things, end quote. Hardly a picture of a, quote, passive majority and an active minority, end quote. We are finally told again in the broadsheet that, quote, in the last few days at Bendix, workers have got to know for the first time people who often worked right next to them. For the first time, they are all working together themselves, end quote. How do Big Flame square up all this with their statement that, quote, relationships did not basically change during the occupation, end quote? How basic is this? If they mean that there was no revolution, they are right. If they mean that hundreds of people didn't find themselves doing things or thinking things they had neither done nor thought before, they are wrong. Is Big Flame allergic to such facts? Or is it just that they are not too concerned about such trifles as reality, coherence, and consistency? But Big Flame's muddle-headedness doesn't end there. The broadsheet tells us that 20 stewards are doing nearly everything, end quote. Their letter implies that these 20-odd characters were dominating every one of the very numerous committees, taking every decision, miraculously getting everything endorsed, systematically denying a voice to the rank and file. If Big Flame believe all this, the first prize for utter confusion must surely go to their statement that, quote, there weren't enough stewards, end quote. Big Flame must think their readers are utter morons. We don't dispute that there were, in all probability, bureaucratic and manipulatory aspects to the behavior of certain shop stewards at Fisher Bendix. We are not claiming that from one day to the next people nurtured in the tradition of bureaucratic maneuvering challenged their spots. In our pamphlet, written at the height of the occupation, we warn that, quote, if occupation is pushed and manipulated by such people, i.e. trade union officials or members of a, quote, vanguard, end quote, type party, the very form it takes may result in workers being denied the right themselves to manage their own struggles. Under such circumstances, occupation would not automatically result in a more advanced type of struggle, end quote. But at Fisher Bendix, this was not, as at that stage, the main point. We were interested in what was new in Fisher Bendix, not in what is the common denominator of so many industrial disputes today. The point of a pamphlet like ours was to bring to other workers information denied them by the mass media and by the traditional revolutionary press. This information, to be helpful, must of necessity hinge on the new developments thrown up in the course of the struggle itself. If nothing more important emerges from the reading of our pamphlet, than that some workers in struggle grasp the need to concentrate in their own hands as many as possible of the physical resources of the firm, i.e. the full implications of the, quote, raid, end quote, on the Moorgate Road stores, as well as the need to involve their relatives in collective decision-making, then our pamphlet, in our opinion, will have been well worth producing. If Big Flame believed that all stewards, in all circumstances, are irreversibly integrated into the trade union bureaucracy, they should say so openly in their publications. They don't. One can only conclude that they speak with one voice in their public utterances, and with another when they throw shit on other groups. The politics of confusion. All this flows, of course, from an inability to think dialectically, to see contradictory aspects of a reality at any given time, to recognize what is a developing tendency, to be encouraged, assisted, and publicized, and what is a declining one, to be helped to the grave or just ignored. In the simplistic world of Big Flame, everything is seen in black and white. The workers are seen as the embodiment of good, even when they talk of running the factories, quote, efficiently, end quote, which in the context of their present consciousness means according to the norms of bourgeois cost-effectiveness. The shop stewards, on the other hand, are seen as totally integrated into the trade union bureaucracy. The fact that stewards are usually elected regularly and are irrevocable, whereas the trade union officials are often neither, just doesn't come into the picture. Things can't be described as they are. They must conform to models. Quote, my mind is made up. Don't confuse me with facts. End quote. For instance, Big Flame's letter claims that the members of the occupation committee, quote, acted in the way that good trade unionists always do and within the structure they have always known, end quote. This is both inaccurate and leads Big Flame to turn a blind eye to what was really new, and immensely encouraging in the Fisher-Bendix occupation, namely the notion of mass meetings attended by wives and relatives who in this way would be less liable to the pernicious pressures of the mass media. Did the shop stewards, in fact, quote, act in the way that good trade unionists always do, end quote? Sit-ins bring workers from different unions together as workers. Is this really one of the traditional concerns of the trade union bureaucracy? Why does Big Flame regard the stewards, all faced with the sack, as the inevitable enemies of the workers under all circumstances? Are they not workers too, also liable to be affected by the redundancies, and also interested in struggling against them in the most efficient way possible? We have repeatedly denounced the usurpation of the function of shop steward by members of various vanguard sects. We saw no reason, however, to drive a wedge between stewards and men in a situation like Fisher-Bendix, where there was not much conflict of interest. Blindness to what was new also led Big Flame to underestimate the significance of the seizure of the stores from the Moorgate Road Depot at a very early stage of the dispute. Are raids of this kind now to be regarded as routine operations run by trade union officials? We felt such events were important, and we stressed them because they show that workers are beginning to think with their heads instead of with their balls, to plan their actions instead of just reacting to events. Some revolutionaries could well follow the example being set. I'm appreciating the language of this essay. In our pamphlet, we welcomed the development of sit-ins, for which we have been systematically campaigning for years. We also warned of their limitations. We tried to place this tactic in the context of a number of possible methods of struggle. All this is too complicated for Big Flame, who in their new enthusiasm for the sit-in, denounce, quote, the utter folly of strikes, end quote. We would have enjoyed watching them expound this doctrine to the miners' pickets outside any large power station. This nonsense, again, flows from Big Flame's, quote, all or none, end quote, one or the other, end quote, totally undifferentiated approach to real problems. We don't consider this particularly helpful. Sure, the Big Flame broadsheet makes no great demands on those who read it, but this is for the simple reason that it makes no such demands on those who write it. Where the confusion of Big Flame's politics, or rather non-politics, reached its zenith, was in their publication in the broadsheet of a, quote, statement from the work people, end quote. This wasn't a statement from the work people at all, as anyone with an ounce of political savvy would immediately have recognized. It was a Stalinist-inspired political document signed by a number of the real local trade union bureaucrats. Big Flame published it without comment. They therefore appeared to endorse what the document said. The document supports the actions of Merseyside Labour MPs in the House of Commons. These fakers want to call for a, quote, inquiry, end quote, in political terms, an investigation sponsored by a government representing the interest of capital. The, quote, statement, end quote, then proceeded to denounce the Tories for their attitude to closures and unemployment. But it didn't utter a squeak about massive closures and sackings under a Labour government, which also represented the interest of capital. If all this isn't mystification with a vengeance, what the hell is it? Solidarity is accused of not being able to distinguish between workers and shop stewards. We deny this charge, but it is certainly a less serious charge than confusing the voice of the, quote, work people, end quote, with the farts of the local Stalinist apparatus. This guy's... Mr. Brinton's killing it, yeah? There is no vacuum in politics. The, quote, non-politics, end quote, of Big Flame leads directly to the uncritical dissemination by an allegedly revolutionary paper of the politics of our opponents. Autonomy and spontaneity. This leads us to discuss, in conclusion, two important areas which differentiate us from groups such as Big Flame. One concerns, quote, autonomy and, quote, spontaneity. The other, the difference between being a, quote, militant and being a, quote, revolutionary. There seems to be a great deal of confusion in the revolutionary movement about such concepts as, quote, autonomy and, quote, spontaneity. The words are not synonymous, as is so often assumed. Autonomous, strictly speaking, means that, quote, which makes its own laws, end quote, and therefore, by implication, quote, which acts in its own interest, end quote. An autonomous working class action is one in which workers have acted with their own independent class objective in mind. These objectives are totally different from the objective of, quote, their, end quote, employers, of, quote, their, end quote, firm, of, quote, their, quote, country, of, quote, their, end quote, country, or of, quote, their, end quote, union leaders. Autonomous class action becomes possible when the working class sees itself as, quote, a class for itself, end quote, to use Marx's phrase, i.e., a class consciously, explicitly, and collectively concerned with its own fate in society. Full autonomy has both ideological and organizational components. Ideological autonomy denotes that one has gained as much understanding and insight as possible into the influences that mold one's thinking. It means that one's thinking has been freed as much as possible of alien class influences, of alien class values, of alien class, quote, rationality, end quote. To gain ideological autonomy is a different process. Gaining ideological autonomy requires that one identify the numerous residues of bourgeois thinking we all carry with us because of the society in which we live. These are often much more powerful and deeply implanted than people imagine. The working class struggle for autonomy is the struggle to free itself of all that lingers on, in its thinking, in its habits, and in its own patterns of organization of the society it is fighting against. For revolutionaries, to assist working class autonomy means to denounce the various mystifications that prevent the working class from achieving this kind of insight. Among such mystifications are the Leninist myth that, quote, the working class can only achieve a trade union consciousness, end quote. The myth that socialist consciousness has to be injected into the working class movement by middle-class professional revolutionaries. The myth that Russia and China are some kind of, quote, workers' state, end quote. The myth that the Labor Party is a working class party, etc., etc. To assist the development of genuine autonomy means a conscious refusal to pander to working class backwardness, to working class confusion, or to working class illusions, for the sake of immediate popularity. It means consciously vaccinating oneself against the disease of, quote, workeritis, end quote. It means consciously vaccinating oneself against the disease... Reread the same line. It means consciously vaccinating oneself against the disease of, quote, workeritis, end quote. A condition in which everything the working class says or does, however reactionary, is miraculously endowed with transcendently positive qualities. Organizational autonomy means the creation or development of organizations totally controlled by the workers themselves, with which they can totally identify. No such organization exists today. No such organizations exist today. At certain times and in certain places, workers' councils have approximated to this type of organization. Revolutionaries should constantly be advocating the organizational autonomy of the working class, the breaking of all bonds which tie the working class to bodies controlled by the employers or by their state. They should denounce the stranglehold of the trade union bureaucracy on working class organization. But if such organizations are to be genuinely autonomous, revolutionaries will also have to denounce their usurpation or their manipulation by Stalinist, Trotskyist, or Maoist micro-bureaucrats. In practice, this would mean explaining the real nature of the Stalinist-controlled Liaison Committee for the Defense of Trade Unions, of the SLL-controlled All Trade Unions Alliance, and of similar bodies. SLL is the Socialist Labor League, it says here. Patiently explaining the real nature of these bureaucracies is a political task. It cannot be done by simply piling invectives on particular opponents because of their ethnic background or sexual habits. These methods do not contribute to autonomous politics. On the contrary, they pander to the most backward tendencies among workers. It will be seen that autonomous action requires a high level of working class consciousness. It can take place suddenly, or on the contrary, be spread out over a considerable period. It is not in the least, quote, spontaneous, end quote. Quote, spontaneity, end quote, on the other hand, denotes something which seems to happen without apparent cause, without obviously being the result of previous preparation, in the sense of, quote, an effect without a cause, end quote. There is probably no such thing as, quote, spontaneity, end quote, in politics or in life. Human reactions are always largely determined by previous experiences. If the person who reacts, quote, spontaneously, end quote, is not consciously aware of why he is acting in a given way, this does not at all mean that there are no causes for his actions. It only means that the causes elude him because they are subconscious. Such subconscious drives reflect previous conditioning. From a class point of view, quote, spontaneous, end quote, actions may be positive or negative. They may reflect tendencies to genuine autonomy, or they may reflect all the prejudices of established society. Quote, spontaneous, end quote, action is usually taken to mean action which breaks out without having been planned beforehand. It does not in the least follow that such an action will be in the long-term interest of workers. It could be, quote, spontaneously, end quote, reactionary. Of course, there are positive, quote, spontaneous, end quote, actions, i.e., quote, spontaneous, end quote, actions which assist or reflect the development of class autonomy. These should be reported fully. Of course, groups of conscious militants can play an important role in triggering off crucial events. We have described this process repeatedly in our publications, whether dealing with particular industrial disputes or with larger events like the Hungarian Revolution or May 1968 in France. But one shouldn't invent, quote, spontaneous, end quote, actions out of deference to some nebulous concept of, quote, spontaneity, end quote. And it is even less permissible to ignore real actions because you have disagreements with those who initiated them. This history, a la carte, helps no one. Tidying up reality is a fruitless pastime. Only the truth is revolutionary. Because of our opposition to traditional Bolshevik types of revolutionary organization, solidarity is often accused of, by the traditional revolutionaries, of being advocates of, quote, spontaneity, end quote. With a blissful disregard for evidence, they do this, despite our constant endeavor to avoid using politically meaningless terms like, quote, spontaneity, end quote. Footnote. The latest example of this nonsense is to be found in Tariq Ali's The Coming British Revolution, published in 1972. Apparently, quote, solidarity's belief in spontaneously generated political consciousness, end quote, leads us to, quote, deny the need for any organization, end quote. Both the premise and the conclusion are false. The, quote, argument, end quote, is non sequitur. For an analysis of how we see the development of working class consciousness, see Solidarity, Volume 5, Number 12. End of footnotes. Big Flame reflects another kind of confusion. We are accused of denying, quote, autonomy, end quote, to a group of workers because in our pamphlet we did not mention one of their allegedly, quote, spontaneous, end quote, actions. We have argued earlier about the facts themselves. It is difficult to argue here about the ideas because words are used without any real thought as to those words' meaning. quote, militants and, quote, revolutionaries. There is also much confusion in the political scene today as to the difference between, quote, militants and, quote, revolutionaries. The main difference between militants and revolutionaries is a question of politics. We don't mean party or institutionalized politics, but politics in the full sense of the term, namely concern about everything that goes on around us, and in particular about the relations of people to the society they wish to overthrow. A militant is someone who sees only a part of social reality. The militant struggle is confined to a limited area: industry, education, the tenants movement, women's liberation, etc. A revolutionary, on the other hand, seeks to develop an overall understanding and hence an overall theory concerning the structure of class society. A revolutionary is interested in the various mechanisms which hold it together and whereby it perpetuates itself. This should lead him to examine a wide range of phenomena, including the internalization of the values of class society and into his own thinking and behavior. A militant may be involved in very radical struggle, say at work, and then come home and wallop his kids or his wife who want to play or talk, whereas he wants to watch the telly. He will not realize that his actions at home are in complete contradiction with his struggle at work, because he does not relate them. He does not realize the relevance of his personal attitudes to a generalization and a better understanding of the meaning of his struggle. He is not aware of the necessity to place his struggle at work into the wider context of the struggle for the liberation of people in all aspects of their lives and at all levels. Similarly, many women may achieve deep insight into their centuries-old exploitation by both men and class society, and yet fail to perceive the significance of authoritarian relations to other areas of life. Some of the most vociferous militants of women's liberation can, for instance, consider themselves, quote, Maoists. They can boast of the, quote, equality of women in China, end quote, and ignore the fact that until recently, over 100 members of the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party, there were only 2 women. Of the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party, there were only 2 women: Lin Piao's wife and Mao's. And we don't know what's happened, and we don't know what happened to the former, Lin Piao's wife. A revolutionary, aware of the need of this wider outlook and integrating his experiences and those of others into a coherent pattern, will therefore make a more total criticism of the social and economic order. He or she will consider any form of human self-activity in general, be it economic, political, sexual, social, or cultural, as relevant to the general struggle towards a self-managed society. It does not follow that a revolutionary holds any truth or blueprint, nor that he or she has solved all the contradictions of his or her life, or of his or her relationship with other people. These contradictions, being social, cannot be solved on an individual level. But the fundamental difference between revolutionaries and militants is that revolutionaries will rarely even be aware, Jesus Christ. But the fundamental difference between revolutionaries and militants is that militants will rarely be even aware that they and everybody else have such problems. They will often dismiss any attempt at discussing them as irrelevant or a, quote, diversion, end quote, from their particular struggles, precisely because they haven't yet, for various reasons, generalized the meaning of these struggles into a total critique of society at all levels. We have been told that the production of historical pamphlets, or of such pamphlets as The Crisis of Modern Society and The Irrational in Politics, are a, quote, waste of time, end quote, because they are not, quote, activity, end quote. We have been told that work among scientists or heated arguments about ideas are a, quote, diversion from the class struggle, end quote. We shudder to think of the type of, quote, socialism, end quote, that would be introduced by those who feel that the subjects dealt with in these publications are, quote, marginal, end quote, and, quote, can be left to look after themselves, end quote. It is because of our belief that they can be rationally discussed with industrial workers as with any other group of people, and that this is important, that solidarity is a political organization, and not just a journal of industrial agitation. We feel that lasting effects on people's thinking is more likely to flow from involvement in all that affects them in their everyday life, and not just from involvement in their struggles at work. But our concept of being, quote, revolutionaries, end quote, as distinct from just militants, is very different from what is generally understood by the term. By, quote, being revolutionaries, end quote, we don't mean, as the Leninists do, belonging to some vanguard party, destined to lead the masses into the promised land. The Leninist considers themselves as embodying some kind of absolute, quote, revealed, end quote, truth, and as being the incarnation of the, quote, historical interest of the working class, end quote. For us, being revolutionaries only means seeing a little further than others. What we see should change, as does society itself. For us, there is no such thing as an absolute truth, whether in politics or elsewhere, and the idea of a complete and final theory embodied in the practice of some party is, in the modern era, nothing but a bureaucrat's dream, and moreover a tool helping him manipulate the oppressed. For us, revolutionaries are not an isolated elite, destined to any vanguard role. They are a product, albeit the most lucid product, of the disintegration of existing society and of the growing awareness of what it will have to be replaced by. Populism, a dead end. Heated political arguments are useful among revolutionary groups provided they share a certain measure of understanding. Argument is difficult if one group consistently refuses to spell out its views, an attitude which itself reveals much more than it conceals. Big Flame's sudden outburst against our coverage of the Fisher-Bendix occupation highlights this problem. We have attempted to answer their misrepresentation point by point, but that is not enough. What prompted Big Flame to launch such a caricature of a critique? Was it a difference in political outlook? To grant this would imply that Big Flame had previously expressed its own political conceptions, its own, quote, worldview, end quote. But this is precisely what Big Flame has failed to do. Nowhere, to our knowledge, has Big Flame explained its reason for existing as a tendency separate from the rest of the left. This would involve answering certain questions. For instance, what does Big Flame think of the shop stewards movement, of the different trade union bureaucracies, of the very concept of trade unionism, of the Labor Party, of the Communist Party and its industrial base, of the traditional groups of the Leninist left? What do they think of the various, quote, national liberation struggles, end quote, of Premier Castro, Che Guevara, Chairman Mao, Uncle Ho, peasant struggles, urban guerrillism, the IRA, and what about the other areas of everyday life which express clearly the decay and instability of this system outside of the more economistic emphasis of Big Flame? Is this not politics? If not, why not? A Philistine disregard for substance is seen in this pearl, cut from their bulletin. Quote, we want to help establish a network, but we want it to be a network of activists who attempt to link and show the relevance of different struggles. We don't want to send our bulletin to people who aren't preparing to do anything, end quote. The criteria for earning Big Flame's approval is then doing, quote, anything, end quote. But what? Populist activism is based on myth. The myth which claims that working class origins themselves constitute a guarantee for being revolutionary. Such an attitude is found mainly among impatient middle-class radicals who have half-digested socialism and are ashamed of their background. Since the trade union bureaucracy is mostly composed of people coming from the working class, some of the intellectuals infected with this kind of populism tend to confuse the bureaucracy with the class itself. Thus, an informal fusion, usually ideological, occurs between the, quote, worker populist, end quote, and various currents which seek to reform the union. Such a trend has already emerged, for example, in Big Flame's uncritical publication of Lessons of the Postal Strike by the Merseyside Postal Alliance. The pamphlet has good material in it, but is marred by mystified conclusions such as, quote, our union needs to be democratized, end quote. Big Flame's lack of coherence is understandable. The, quote, worker populist, end quote, considers that, quote, support, end quote, for, quote, masses in struggle, end quote, is enough. Criticism of the political content of these struggles is considered divisive, sectarian, or coming from, quote, academic quarters, end quote. The attempt is made to consciously castrate any revolutionary critique based on clear theoretical concepts. Big Flame attempts to drive a reactionary wedge between revolutionary workers and other revolutionaries. It does so by pandering to the worst anti-intellectual prejudices of many workers. Historically, these prejudices have been whipped up by the trade union bureaucracy. The nauseating recent example of Ray Gunter is there to emphasize the point. Prejudices have also been whipped up by various political parties that have acquired a working class electorate, often with disastrous results for the working people. Big Flame's anti-intellectualism isolates those numerous worker intellectuals within any working class who, by their own sustained efforts and persistent devotion to the liberation of their class, have long since abandoned prejudices which still haunt Big Flame. If all that Big Flame can offer as a political explanation of itself is recipes for collective, quote, involvement, end quote, certain questions still remain. On what basis will decisions be taken? What are the group's politics? The last 10 years have seen dozens of groups appear which have sought to avoid, quote, politics, end quote, some within the solidarity movement itself. They have all either disappeared without leaving a trace, or more particularly in the United States, they have degenerated and in their decrepitude become either liberal or Stalinoid, quote, third worldists, end quote. Quote, going to the working class, end quote, is not a political program or a critique of society. It is not even the basis for a viable group, as our, quote, Neo-Narodniks, end quote, will sooner or later discover. Big Flame's practical activities, or those of any group, implicitly define a worldview. It is high time the supporters of Big Flame saw explicitly to ascertain the views of those who found their group. The fact that Big Flame politics haven't been made clear up till now leads one to suspect that a deeply manipulative game is being played, a game in the tradition of the Leninist left. The example of certain Italian groups is there for all to see. The libertarian left in Britain has been weak in showing that conscious intervention can help make a, quote, uncritical, end quote, mass action a more coherent and lasting one. The difference is enormous. Working people don't live in a vacuum, and part of their age-long problem is the deep cleavage between what they do and what they say they are doing. The question is not to clap from the sidelines and enter into raptures about, quote, self-management, end quote, whenever one sees a group of workers attempting to control their own lives in living struggle. Varying degrees of, quote, self-management, end quote, are implicit in the daily existence of working people, and become deeper and explicit in struggle, simply because no struggle can be won, even in trade union terms, without a measure of self-activity. The revolutionary dimension appears and develops when the conscious and deliberate critique of society by the working class fuses with its practical, quote, self-activity, end quote, reinforcing it, and in turn being nourished by the elemental drive of a class striving for full self-consciousness. It is here that groups of, quote, pamphleteers, end quote, yes, quote, pamphleteers, end quote, like Solidarity can and must intervene and fuse their politics with the revolutionary action of masses of people who just do, quote, anything, end quote, will probably end up doing the donkey work for the reactionary tendencies in any such mass activity. Big Flame has no consistent politics on any issue. On any particular issue, it must therefore have a whole series of formulas copied from the whole range of left organizations in Britain and elsewhere. Thus, at times, it might appear to uphold the strivings of the rank and file, at others it will confuse these strivings with the actions of the trade union bureaucracy, thus consciously adopting a semi-Trotskyist stance. This, quote, attitude, end quote, must of course extend to all areas of the group's involvement, student milieu, quote, youth culture, end quote, women's liberation, claimants' unions, community politics, etc. And if its roots were Leninist yesterday, they might become Leninist again tomorrow. After all, if politics is just a question of, quote, doing something, end quote, then the rest can all be bought at bargain prices in any revolutionary supermarket. We have no monopoly of the truth and do not for a minute deny Big Flame's or anyone else's right to be as critical as they like of Solidarity's ideas or methods of action. We do, however, demand that criticisms be honest and informed, aimed at helping the movement forward, and not just ignorant gossip. We are, we confess, surprised at Big Flame's method to disseminate, quote, information, end quote, about the allegedly, quote, criminal, end quote, attitude of another tendency in the movement without having first attempted to ascertain the facts by approaching that organization directly, and while maintaining a facade of comrade relations, is not in keeping with expected norms of behavior between libertarians. It smacks of a very different tradition. We can see no rational reason for the malevolence behind Big Flame's letter, which we can only construe as a hostile act. We will not be mealy-mouthed or pull our punches in answering back. Our reply, however, unlike their attack, will be both political and principled. Nothing but good can come from such a confrontation of views and methods. Solidarity Discussion Bulletin, February 1972.